All right, now that we have the basic table view cell wired up, we want to add the auto layout constraints so that it can handle the wrapping for these labels as well as the dynamic height table rows. So if I come back in here, make this go away, and so my technique for auto layout is you kind of want to, it's easy to get confused pretty quickly, and so I think it's best to kind of start from the top left here and work your way down to the bottom right. Don't kind of jump around and add constraints because it's kind of hard to inspect once there's a bunch of constraints added in here. So I'm going to start with the image view, and I'll throw in the kind of left and top constraints. Maybe type that in, make that 8, and then add in my size constraints. And there's actually a constraint technically to the bottom as well, but it's kind of interesting because the bottom constraint here, sometimes, in this case, it looks like the labels are always going to be below the image view, but in cases where you have maybe this is driving the height of the cell or this is driving the height of the cell, in other words, maybe this is taller or this is taller, then they both actually have to have a bottom constraint with the cell to kind of push the bottom of the cell down. So I don't want this to be a fixed bar. In fact, I want this to be a inequality. So I'm happy as long as it's greater than or equal to, and then choose whatever bottom padding that you want. Like let's say 12. Right. So as long as this is saying as long as I'm at least 12 from the bottom, then I'll be okay. And maybe this one will have some similar bottom constraint, and then one of them will win. So with this constraint alone, that's not sufficient yet. So once I have the rules set up, I go back to my business view controller, and then I specify that the table view has to have a row height of UI table view automatic dimension. And what this is saying is, use whatever the auto layout constraint rules told you to do. And when you use this has to be used in conjunction with another parameter called the estimated row height. And this happens actually kind of for a silly reason. There's a scroll bar indicator over here that can be very long, right? Imagine that you have thousands of table views, and so your scroll bar indicator is going to be really small, right? So if you were calculating auto layout rules for 1,000 cells, it's going to be really, really slow. And so that's what the estimated row height property is for. It says, well, just ballpark it to be something. And this is only used for the scroll height dimension. And then for the real row height, when the cells are actually visible, then at that time, lazily figure out what the height of the thing should be based on the auto layout constraints. So build that. And let's run that and see what we see here. So what I can see is that my labels here are still getting clipped, right? But my cells are shrinking to respect that bottom. I think I had a 15 pixel margin right here, so I had 8, 8, and then 15. And then in some cases, I wonder if I can find it. Yeah, I'm not gonna clip any of the data, but just barely, right? So for example, if I come back to the storyboard and start working on the labels, in this label, I'll add in here a top and left constraint, and get it to update my frames. So one key with labels are really finicky in iOS, and the first trick is that before you start any resizing, I'm gonna hit Command equal on all of these. Command equals causes this to fit to size. So you see how this now shrinks down. Now I might have to kind of lay this out a little bit, but you can actually click on all of these and hit Command equal. So before you do any kind of resizing, make sure you do that. Okay, so I'm gonna nudge this around a bit. All right, so for this first label, right now the auto layout has been added. So if I run this just at this point, then I'm going to see that instead of getting clipped, it's going to expand the label to fit. Now I can see that this is going to cause me problems because it's going to start to run into other labels right here. Now what I want it to do is when it gets to a point where it's going to collide with a label, I want it to wrap. So the first thing that I'm going to do, let me actually move these down just a few pixels here. And I'm actually going to take this label and I'm going to move the font down. It looks a little bit too big. Maybe to that. And then command equal size to fit again. So that's looking better, but then if I look at Basil Thai Restaurant Bar, I can see that I would want that to wrap to another line. Cool. So you can see I'm adding the constraints really slowly, just kind of and running them. These don't have auto layout constraints, so it's just going to ignore those rules for now. Okay, so this is, I'm going to make this a baseline alignment. And I'm going to add a constraint for this guy right here. I'm going to say top and left. Actually, not top, because I want it to be not aligned with respect to the top, but aligned with respect to this baseline here. Okay. So this is still not going to help me with the collision. Because here I can see that while this does have a constraint, now they're baseline aligned, they are going to still run into each other. So you would think that you would just add a margin constraint right here at 70. But the problem with that is that, think about if this is too long or too short, then this is not going to be exactly 70 anymore. So what I really want this to be is I want this to be, well, one way to solve this is I could have this be an inequality constraint and have it be something like some spacing here, right? I chose 8 now. So let me run that and show you what happens there. So I can see that I was a little bit surprised. In fact, it did respect the 8, but what it did was, in order to, it didn't wrap this, it just forced this to start to truncate, right? Now, one problem is that for this line, I have to make sure that this line is set to either 1 or 2 or 0 to make sure that it's going to wrap appropriately. But we can see here that specifying that I want it to be 0 lines isn't enough to cause it to wrap, because it's going to prefer truncation before it prefers wrapping. So there's a couple ways to solve this problem. One way is to set this back to an equal constraint, right? And it's going to complain because it's trying to respect this margin for you here. But there's just too many rules for it, right? So I have these fixed lengths, and then there's also an unspoken rule that it wants to kind of fit the content snugly, right? So this label wants to fit the content snugly, and so does this one, but something's got to give, right? And so the desire to fit the content snugly is called the content hugging property. It's a really cute name. So this priority says, hey, I really prefer my width to be just enough to serve my content, right? So what we can say is, hey, for your name, this name Grand Poobah, we can say, let me reduce the priority of the content hugging. And all that means is it says, try to fit the content, but don't try as much as this label. So if this label really wants it, this is at 251, then this label should have it. Now, these numbers don't really matter. It can be any value. But typically it's, just toggle it between 1 or 2 values. You'll need as many distinct values as you have distinct labels in play. And so in here, there's only 2 labels in play, and we only need 2 values. The values don't matter as long as one is greater than the other. So if I run this now, I can see that this is still causing truncation here. So if I come back to here, I can see that there's one more thing, right? So content hugging is the desire to fit the content. Content compression is the desire to avoid truncation. What it's saying is like, well, smash in the side walls of the label up into the point where it avoids truncation. And so the problem is that it's still preferring to truncate rather than to wrap this label. And what you have to do is you have to tell this label, hey, I really don't want to truncate, right? So you want to increase the priority of this compression resistance. Again, the value doesn't matter. It just needs to be greater than the value here of 750. So if I run this, it's no longer going to truncate, but as you can see here that there's some issue with the wrapping. Now I'm going to show you something weird here, where if I scroll this off and scroll this back on, you see how that's wrapping correctly now. Now this is just, I think, in my opinion, it's an iOS bug. I'm not sure what Apple was thinking. But what you need to do is, in this business cell, there's another property, right? So this is called the name label. Name label dot preferred max layout width. So what this preferred, where do you think a label should wrap? I think it should wrap based on the width of the label, right? I think it's pretty common sense. Unfortunately, Apple thinks it should wrap based on this other value, preferred max layout width. Now, I don't know a situation where you would want the wrapping to be different than what the width of the label is. But the point is that sometimes this is out of sync. And so once the cell comes awake, so once the cell gets instantiated, I need to sync up this preferred max layout width with the actual size of the label. So size.width. And I have to do it again in another place. So when this is great, this works. Well, I mean, let's just check. So now I see this is wrapping immediately. But the problem is that when this rotates, right, it's still going to be not quite correct. So when this rotation happens, there's another function here that's going to be called on top of for the cell. It's called layout subview. So make sure you call super.layout subviews here. You always want, if you're ever overriding anything in views or view controllers, you always want to make sure you call the parent function. And then you have to do this. You have to do this again, right? So this means, hey, whenever the parent changes dimension, I might potentially need to do this again. So if we kind of take stock of where we are, I can see that this is correct, and my miles, I think I made a mistake by linking it to the baseline. So I'm going to come back in here, and I'm going to remove that baseline constraint, and instead I'll just pin it to the top margin here, because it looks like that's what this is doing. It's just always being consistent with the top. So I'll add in one more margin here for the top margin, and run it one last time. So now I have things correct for this image, then this title, and this upper right-hand label. So now I just need to repeat for the others, and the others are much easier. All right, it's horizontally adjacent labels that are the most complex. So this is an image view, so I add the width and height constraints, put margins pretty much all the way around, right? That's going to pin me to the label and this label, and you only need to do that once. And what I mean by that is when I go here, I don't make a left margin here. That constraint already exists. And then so I can align this one. Maybe I'll align these so they're centered. Right, and for this one I'll just pin, just really simple here. I'm not going to add a constraint between these two because I don't think they're going to collide. But if they were going to, then I would do the same thing I did with the labels above. And here I already have that top margin, so I'm just going to add one for the left and one for the bottom. Oh, maybe I didn't add the top one. And then so this thing, I'm just going to inspect it. Yep, there is no bottom margin here. So here I'll just add a top constraint as well. So I'm going to hit this down arrow, make sure that it's, oh, yep, so it's linked to the reviews. That's actually fine, but I'm going to link it to the image view here. That's 4 pixels away. Okay, and then now this label is happy. And I finally come back down to this label and give it a constraint as well. So I'll just cause this to be lined up on the left here. So I'll line up their leading edges. And just like that image view, I still have to create a constraint against the bottom. Right? And so this constraint, just like the image view one, is going to be an inequality constraint. So greater than or equal to, you know, whatever you want, right? Like, let's say maybe 12. So if I run this again, let's just spot check this. I have dynamic height labels. You can see this one's a little bit taller than this one. Everything looks like it's wrapping properly. And then here's maybe a problem. So this one right here, this address looks like it's, maybe this one should have wrapped. And so what I'm going to do is, I'm actually going to decrease the font a little bit. But if I take this, just like this Grand Poobah one, except even easier, right? Because there's no horizontally adjacent thing. I just need to say, hey, you should wrap for as many times as you need to. So increase the number of lines there. And in order for it to wrap, I need to give it a relationship to this right-hand side. So I'm going to say, you know what? Just don't get closer than, say, maybe 8 to the right-hand side. And I'm going to update the frames here so the constraints win. So now if I look at that one that was truncated before, so this thing here was really close. North Beach / Telegraph Hill used to be really flush against this. Now it's wrapping around. So that's pretty much it. It looks good. Let me try to rotate this. Cool. Looks good on rotation as well. And that's it for this auto layout portion.